Hello, everyone. So, about to discuss, I guess, on International Men's Day, some topics around male role models. I think when I told my wife and all the female colleagues and friends in my life that I was doing this panel, they all said it's International Men's Day every day, right? It's Men's Day every day. And I said to them, I hear you, but did you know that men are more likely to commit suicide? Did you know that men fall behind women when it comes to academic studies? Did you know that men are more likely to be victims of violent crime, et cetera, et cetera? And she was quite surprised about some of the stats on this. And so I want to talk about that, but also I want to talk about the positivity around male masculinity. We have a lot of positive role models, and today we're going to try and talk about some of the complexities, particularly in the workplace, of us being male leaders in the workplace. So I'm going to now I'm going to let you introduce yourselves. So Shane, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Shane O'Brien's my name. I'll know many people in the audience. I work in Aviva Investors. I am actually on my first day back from paternity leave today, so nice way to ease my way in. But I head up the team of investment specialists in Aviva Investors, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm quite excited to talk about some of these topics.
Great. Mitesh?
Hi everyone, Mitesh Sheth. Also pleased to be here. My daughter, when I told her this morning that I was speaking about this, also said, surely it's International Men's Day every day, and then said, Dad, please don't get yourself cancelled. So, with that wise advice, I sit here a bit more nervously than I might normally do.
Great, and my name's Matt Cameron, so I'm part of LGBT Great, but also on the board for the Diversity Project as well. And yeah, really excited to be on this panel today, because I think this is like the first all-men sort of kind of work thing that I've done. And probably for a long, long time, actually, even going back to school, where it's like, you know, the PE class and football teams and things. It's the first thing I've done for a long, long time that's all men, so exciting.
Okay, so we're going to get into it. We're going to try and make it conversational. I'm going to start with a question, and then hopefully we'll flow from there. I guess the first question, how has your understanding of masculinity evolved throughout your career? What does being a man in the workplace mean today versus historically? And do you want to start, Shane?
Yeah, it's definitely changed. I'm just back from paternity leave. I'm a man and I've been off for 6 months.
6 months?
6 months, yeah. So it's definitely changed. For me, going into the workplace almost 20 years ago now for me, the traditional man and the traditional leader, male leader, was one of, this is a bit of a stereotype, but it's kind of my experience. Quite confident, quite self-assured, quite loud, quite decisive, quite individual. And I guess that's what I thought being a male leader was for quite some time. And I guess over the years, through experience and through understanding what's actually more effective in terms of results, but also what's more authentic to me, I've realized that being a male role model and being a male leader for me now is very different to that. It's one of being honest, being vulnerable, being collaborative. And I know these all sound like kind of generic phrases, but it's true. I think that approach of being individual and being the kind of alpha male it's not particularly productive for the broader business, but I also think it's quite interesting to think of the implications it has for the individual. I think the stereotypical alpha male, confident male, is one that has actually created a really stressful role for themselves in life, to present as being this all-knowing, decisive person that's never under pressure and, can always handle everything and never needs help from anybody. That has unintended consequences for them individually as well as the people around them. So for me, it's developed considerably. What I lived for the first, probably 10 years of my career and what I thought was leadership has evolved. It's only in recent times, to be honest, that I've had the confidence to realize that my approach is different, and I've had the confidence to actually use that approach and to be a bit more vulnerable with the people around me and the team around me. And I know it works, and I've seen it work. So yeah, so it's been quite a journey for me. It's gone from what I've perceived to now something very different.
Do you want to jump in, Mitesh? Because I know when we were planning this call, you were kind of, talking a little bit about vulnerability, or certainly talking in a way that was, to me, quite vulnerable. So do you want to kind of develop on what Shane's saying?
Yeah. So thinking about being a man, growing up as a man, and then kind of in career, I think it's all pretty linked for me. I think I had more stronger female role models in our extended family than I had male role models growing up. And then as a young man, not being interested in football and sport, spending more of my time wanting to read books, have conversations, and then kind of as time moved on and starting in the workplace, not drinking, all made me feel like I wasn't a typical man, or not good enough, or not likely to succeed, and had plenty of people advise me that you need to pick a football team. Just pick anyone. You've got to be able to talk about football. How the hell are you going to have, succeed in your career if you're not able to, or at least come along and pretend to have a drink? I'm sure they serve some kind of cider and whatever else, that a non-alcoholic one that you can get behind. And so all of these things, but it was all kind of trying to, and the number of times fake it till you make it and all of this stuff, like it just didn't work for me. So I think for a lot of time at school, a lot of time at work, I've kind of felt like I'm not your characteristic man. I can't tell you what that is. I think you've covered some of that, but I knew I wasn't it. And then when you peel back the layers, I love singing, and my daughters make fun of this now. I love singing. I'm the first one on a dance floor. And again, found happiest reading a book, never watching football or sport, never talking about it, and never really seen at the pub. So, but I think as it comes to leadership and it comes to workplaces, I think we have seen things change, but I think I think offices are a tough place. I think so little is talked about, and I think certainly leading diverse teams and building diverse teams over the last 20 years, I found men grow quieter and quieter, in a sense, not knowing what to say, whether they're going to trip over themselves, whether they're going to say the right or wrong thing. And I know for myself, recognized really early on that if I can't encourage men to speak up, we're not going to be able to build a more diverse and inclusive team. And that may mean putting their foot in it, that may mean saying the wrong thing, that may mean getting it wrong or whatever, but it felt like the worst thing any man wanted to be labeled is sexist, racist, chauvinist, bigot, or to be cancelled effectively. And the fear of that gets in the way of having kind of adult, professional, sensible, constructive conversations. So I think it's still a work in progress, really.
Okay. And Matt?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to sort of build on there, and a lot of what you talked about as well really resonates, particularly when you think about masculinity as it exists in the earlier part of my life. So certainly within sort of school, it was all about who was on the PE teams predominantly. That's who was popular. It was about playing football, it's about playing rugby, and if you're interested in anything else, you weren't really into the cool club, so to speak. So you spend half your time trying to think about actually how can I do a bit of that so everyone else thinks I'm more of a man, so and so forth. But that constant sort of feeling of not really fitting in, I think, is something that I've experienced in a large part of earlier in my life. And then you sort of come into the workplace, and all of the I came into sort of a sales environment, so all of the super successful people, or the people you perceive to be successful, were all men, predominantly white men. It was very alpha. Certainly didn't talk about emotions. It was around doing whatever you needed to do to get the results. There was no sort of awareness around sort of well-being or mental health either. So I think there's still a little bit of that kind of playing out, a lack of sort of role models. And I think the point Shane made as well, and there's a lot of sort of expectations that go into being a man. And I looked at some data just before this. For those of you who know me, I love data. Tragically, last year in the UK, there was 5,656 registered suicides in the UK, and 74% of those were male. So it just goes to show that, proportionally or disproportionately, there's a huge piece here around the impact on well-being and mental health, and the impact that not talking about your emotions and leaving something at the door every day over time, can sort of really have. So And certainly within my family as well, there's been, in my lifetime since 1987, I've had 3 members of my own family that have taken their lives, and they're all men. Wow. You know, so it just goes to show that there's a huge, there's a huge challenge. And I think breaking down the stereotypes around masculinity and getting more conversations happening and more spaces created in organisations for men to talk about how they're feeling and mental health is something that we've just got to do.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, interestingly, I've had 3 members of my family that have lost their lives to suicide as well, 3 males. So that definitely resonates. And I think, you know, we talk about what's going to change this and what's going to make that space to have the conversation. And I think a lot of it comes from leadership. Like, I really do believe that when you see leaders talk about these things, when you see them act in a certain way, your team is a mirror of your, you know, how you behave, how you show up. And I think it's on people that are, you know, in leadership to really show, you know, those honest characteristics, because it's not going to change. I mean, it's hard to attribute, you know, 74% of them are male. It's hard to attribute why that is. But a huge part of that has to be down to that unwillingness to speak, that unwillingness to share the burden. It might not be all that, but it's certainly a large part of it. And I think a lot about, well, what is it that will create? And you can create all these like spaces and, you know, forums and stuff for people to share views and stuff. But really, I think it's about culture. It's about changing it, and that has to change from the top. It has to be from people showing up and being vulnerable, being okay with saying how they feel. And from there, then you have people that are a bit more willing to share their own story and talk about themselves.
But how do you, it's interesting to me, because when you're talking about safe spaces for men,
Yeah.
I'm like, me as a man just feeling what you're saying, I'm like, that's not a space for me.
No,
right?
I agree.
But I'm just saying,
yeah.
like, how do you like change that? Because obviously it is important. Maybe it's not a safe space, but it's a place where people can talk about some of their issues. Like, how do you kind of encourage it if you can't necessarily create a space? Because not everything's going to appeal to every man, right?
But see, and this is the point. So I'm kind of skeptical of safe spaces because I just don't know how real they are and how they will be used. It certainly wouldn't work for me. But what does work is if it becomes the norm, if it becomes embedded in the culture that it's okay to say, I'm not feeling great today, or whatever it is, I need some help over here, whatever it is. And that might be to everybody, for some people. That might be more comfortable to just pick it up with your boss or whatever, independently. Not everybody's comfortable sharing everything, and that's okay. But I think base level vulnerability is saying, at least at a minimum, putting your hand up and saying, I need some help here. That's base level. And then there's obviously, from there you can build and you can choose yourself how vulnerable you want to be and what you want to share. That's individual. People have different views. But at a minimum, people, particularly men, need to be able to put their hand up and say, I need some help here. And for me, maybe safe spaces and whatnot and building an infrastructure will be helpful. I think what's more helpful is male leaders, role models, showing vulnerability themselves. Because that creates a safe space. It's not about having a forum over here on a Tuesday that everybody can drop into. I'm skeptical as to how useful they are.
I think it is hard because I completely agree. I think it is kind of very much top down and around, and I think there is still so much of an expectation. So having been a CEO, being in a CIO role, from boards all the way down to say you've got to project strength, and you've got to project confidence, and you've got to be able to project, the idea of go out there and say you don't know what to do. Or you feel uncomfortable, and or you're concerned about a situation, or indeed about yourself. It's really hard to do. I've sat in those seats and tried to do it, and got it wrong sometimes, got it better sometimes, but I've rarely felt empowered and encouraged to be as vulnerable as I feel I need to be. And so quite often it's ended up being one-to-one.
But do you feel that as you become more confident, you are more vulnerable?
Yeah, so I think about when it was about 10 years ago, I had a coach, and my kind of first big leadership role, and when I decided I was going to be more vulnerable and talk more about this stuff. And so I think I have definitely, and the more you do it, the better you get at it, and easier it is, and the more you go, oh wow, people connect with me as a result of it. Having felt like an outsider and someone who didn't connect, actually being myself and connecting with people over it was incredible, really empowering actually. But as you do get into those senior roles, I started to feel the other pressure again. That goes, but you have to project strength, and you have to project confidence, and you have to lead from the front. And actually, don't go out and ask people's views and thoughts. Tell them this is where we're going to go. They want to. There's still so much tied up in what is expected of our leaders that I think needs a bit more work still.
I agree.
So do you think, though, you can find a place for both? Because clearly if you consult and with your business or your teams, and then you go out there and you say, right, this is what we're doing, there's a place for both, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can do both. And
but I think often it does. So for me, what seems to have worked is more of a one-to-one. And so I invest, and it's harder as an organization becomes larger. And coming to Newton from Reddington, a 500-person firm versus a 250-person firm, that was a big test. Because a lot of that, I find, is easier to do when you can go and speak to people and say, how do you feel about that?
Yeah.
Right? And we're making this change, and you're uncharacteristically quiet. Right? And noticing that someone's gone quiet, noticing that someone's not present, noticing that they're not speaking up, and being able to talk to them about it, such a big part of it. Because you could call them to a space and not have anyone turn up.
So how's your communication styles changed then? Because you're saying one-to-ones, but over time, going back from traditional male leadership, and you're saying alpha, very direct. Now we've evolved, right? Have we evolved? We have. What is the communication style? How do you kind of break the traditional stereotypes around that kind of topic as well with your staff or people that work for you?
I'm happy to pick up on that. I think I was just reflecting on the reason I put the name on the board before around who's your industry role model. And I think one of the things I noticed from quite a few of those names is there was one kind of theme in that they were all super successful people, pretty senior and powerful positions. But I'd all heard them at some point, or some of the names I recognised, talk about well-being, talk about mental health. I don't know if Stuart White's in the room from HSBC Asset Management, but I remember about a year ago, Stuart was involved in writing an article that talked about his own mental health and the challenges of being, a parent, with supporting your children, with a big role at work. And actually, that was a real moment for me because, you see this person who's, super successful, super senior, who's a white man, and you think, actually, God, I've not actually heard anyone talk about that before as openly and as publicly. So I think maybe that's one of the ways in which we can look to kind of break some of those stereotypes. It's around seeing the people you'd least expect. I think share some of those stories that can really open people's eyes.
Right. Any of you got any thoughts on that as well? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean...
Should you all be writing articles?
I don't know. I mean, my view on leadership has evolved over time, and the reason I was asking the question about, do you become more vulnerable as you become more confident, I certainly have. Yeah. And I feel it makes you a more powerful leader, and it's not easy to do, and as you say, it becomes more difficult. But, I mean, what I've learned over time is to have a really good, strong, functioning team and business, it's built on trust. And it's quite hard to build trust without being vulnerable, without showing a bit of yourself. At least that's how I've found it. So I think you need, and some people are more open than others, and that's okay. Some people want to keep their private life to themselves, and that's okay. But I still feel as a leader, you need to show a bit of yourself, because in showing a bit of yourself, it encourages others to show themselves and to be themselves. And so for me, over time, being a bit more vulnerable, being a bit more collaborative is just a far more effective way of being a leader. So it doesn't come at the expense of results. And I think that's where people get a bit confused in this whole thing. It's like, well, we're going to be less effective. We're going to be, slower moving if we're more collaborative. And I think it's the complete opposite. I think you run into difficulty when it is the one individual that's saying this is the direction, because guess what? People don't feel part of it. Yeah. And then it ends up coming unwound anyway, and then they replace the leader again, and somebody else comes in with a new plan, and they go in that direction again, and copy and paste. And actually what was needed was maybe a little bit more time in the initial part to build that team, build that trust. And then from there you get, immeasurably more results. And you see that in team-based sports all the time. It's sometimes even more measurable. You see how effective that is when there's a proper team-based culture. And there's a leader that comes in and shows himself and brings that kind of trust to the group. And you see it in great businesses as well. But it definitely becomes more difficult in larger companies because there's that pressure of the short-termism. There's a pressure of the result tomorrow. And people then get drawn into feeling that result can be achieved with a new strategy or something new. And that's just not what gets results over the long term. It's a bit slower moving and a bit more, holistic. So for me, basically, the vulnerable part is what creates the high performance. It's not at odds with it, but it does become increasingly difficult to do it, as you get to a higher level. But it's powerful.
Okay. So all three of you are great role models. Some of your names came up on the screen. Who were your role models coming up in your career? Who did you look to? And how did you, because all of you sound like great leaders actually, so how did you learn that stuff? Was it from your role models? How did you learn this? Because I'm sure it wasn't the same day one when you went into your careers.
Let's come back to how I feel about being a role model in a minute, but in terms of the specific question, great role models. So, my dad was the silent, brooding type. So he taught me to work hard and to keep quiet. Somewhat suffer in silence was what I took away. And he worked hard, taught me to do the same. Right. My first real role model as the kind of man that I was and that was come from was my father-in-law, who was very much mucking in at home and got on his hands and knees and played with our kids and was seen just as often with a paintbrush as he was doing community service. And I think that was my first kind of personal experience of a man playing these different roles and kind of struggling, but doing it the best and talking about it. We would sit up late at night talking. In the workplace, I've struggled to find those, and where I did, they didn't feel like people I could relate to. So there were some definitely great. Roger Owen at Willis Towers Watson, was the thinker, an embodiment of a thinker, and someone who spent his time kind of thinking and planning ahead and looking forward, and was hugely inspiring. And David Jacob at Henderson, and Ewan Monroe, now, and particularly in how he carries his faith, on his sleeve, and talks about that, and in his weekly emails talks about his family, his struggles, his health, alongside leading a business. But actually, most of my role models came from outside of work. I was at home with my father-in-law. It was also a charity that I've been involved with, where I was a youth leader for many years, where working with young men and working with other volunteers, where we spent far more time as young people, as young men, talking about our feelings and talking and mentoring other young people. And it was there that I became much more comfortable in my skin and found people that I looked up to and I wanted to learn from. That probably had the biggest shaping of my kind of personality, character, confidence.
Wow. Matt, what about you?
Sure. So I think first role model for me was definitely got to be my dad. So Dad's a gardener, and he always used to take me on his sort of round, if you like, at holidays. So you end up going to pick up the leaves and the grass and put the stuff in the back of the boot. But he always said to me, whatever you do in life, son, always work really hard and be good to people. And it's always sat with me for years and years and years. I think the other role model that early on in my life would have definitely been my granddad. So he was a real grafter. So he used to sell insurance, had an insurance round, as he used to call it. But he was successful in terms of, I guess, professional career, but at the same time had so many human skills in terms of connecting with people. And local community area, there's never, nothing that was never too big for him to sort of do. So I remember him supporting sort of lots of community initiatives and so on and so forth. I think that's probably my family-based role models. And I agree with Mitis, actually. In a lot of my professional career, my role models have come from outside of the workplace as well. And there's kind of lots of people I can think of over the years. There's one person that is my mentor now that was a huge role model, just in terms of respecting what they'd achieved in their career, the fact that they come from essentially nothing and kind of made their own way. It gave me that confidence, actually, that despite coming from a background that was sort of lower social economic, that there was also a route for me as well. And then a lot of my role models have been really successful women, ironically. I can think of so many women that have inspired me, and I think for me, I look up to people that appear super confident, that have a really good message, So I think there's definitely an intersection there of how we think about sort of confidence. And in some of the research that we've done, at LGBT Great as well, we actually looked at what makes a role model. And this was something we looked at 2 years ago. And there's basically 3 big things we found. One was around how they motivate you. 2 is around looking up to people and imitating kind of their skills and aspiring to do some things that they've done. But actually, when it comes to underrepresentation, there was the 3rd dimension that we hadn't seen before. And it's around this idea of sort of finding affirmation, if you like, in your identity. So that's when I started to think about, actually, there are loads of LGBTQ plus role models in my life that that I look up to now as well. So just thinking about it in that kind of motivation, imitation, and affirmation, I think is kind of how I think about role models. And I'd say, again, when we're thinking about men, there's just not enough. The focus just hasn't been on male role models because we kind of think this is a really powerful, successful group of people already and they're okay. And I think sometimes, I don't know what the saying is, but sometimes the things that are looking directly in the face, it's always not what it seems. And I think how we break that stereotype is something that I think male role models and telling stories, I think can really help with.
But telling those stories, and it's great. Thank you so much for being vulnerable. I used to talking about some of your personal experiences. But how do you get the balance between vulnerability and strength? Because clearly, you can't always be vulnerable, right? You've got to lead, and isn't there some strength in leading? Again, maybe I'm too manly. But I'm just saying, isn't there some strength? So how do you find the balance in that?
Don't know. Trying to figure it out, iterating my way there. I think I've definitely had periods where I have been too vulnerable. I've definitely had people come and say, hey, that's oversharing. Or I feel really uncomfortable with what you've just said. And again, I don't think I had anyone in the workplace to look up to, so I didn't know. And to your point, or representation or so on really mattered, actually. When I first became a leader as an executive team at Henderson, I looked around the table, and not only did people not look like me, but the stuff they talked about didn't interest me, and the way they communicated and the way they made decisions in this, there was so much about it that made me feel alien. And I had gone in very confident and sat there feeling very unconfident, and there wasn't much space to be vulnerable and so on. And I remember leaving that firm, but it was as much about leaving leadership for a while to think, I don't know if I can be a leader in this industry. And it was only when I became part of more diverse teams and diverse leadership teams that I felt more at home and more belonging. I saw other people kind of being vulnerable. So I haven't seen great role models in a C-suite role in executive teams show vulnerability and strength. I know I'm trying to. And I think I've definitely oscillated. But I do, in my heart of hearts, believe that I am strongest when I'm vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly.
And I believe that I connect most to the people I work with when I'm vulnerable. Yeah. And I feel like in a world that is changing so rapidly, pretending I know the answer when I don't is worse than going, I haven't got a clue. But together we can figure this out, and we'll place some bets, and we'll adapt really quickly when we get some of them wrong, which is still uncomfortable to say, but it's the truth of how I lead.
I think that is the answer. I think you find being vulnerable gives you strength. So if you can go in a room full of your fellow execs and say, I had a problem today, and this was the problem, I think that gives you strength. Yeah. Because you're different to everyone else, and you can say that and still do the job that you're here to do, but you can share that with them. So I think that's right.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that, I think the key to being able to do that is to have a team around you that you trust.
Yeah.
Because it's really hard. I mean, it's okay to walk into the C-suite and be vulnerable if you feel that other people you've got their trust and they have your trust. If you don't have that trust within the team, it kind of all falls apart. Because people can use your vulnerability against you and kind of say, well, you're not really showing strength and leadership. But if everybody is trustworthy and in it together, then it is the greatest strength. And then everybody's bought into the reality that nobody knows the answer. And you are trying to make the best guess. And usually as a leader, you do have a good intuition, you've good steer. That's probably why you got the job. You do have a good intuition. You will make good decisions, but you won't always. And when you don't know, you are better off to say I don't know and to get get guidance from others than to try and present yourself as the all-knowing. It's not a good outcome.
Yeah, it's a bit risky.
Risky, yeah.
To say the least. What role does the emotional intelligence play in modern male leadership? So do you think this vulnerability is making you more emotionally intelligent? Are you able to then kind of relate to your staff better? Does it make you stronger as well? Does it make you a better leader? And this is obviously from the perspective as a male in the workplace, right? So emotional intelligence, tell me.
Like, it's massive, and it's one of those things that it's hard to define. You know, it's hard to say to somebody, you know, you should go off and be more emotionally intelligent. So it's not an easy thing, but it's crucial because of course there's a line between, you know, walking in the door every day and telling everybody everything that happened at home, and you know, that's not sensible either. You know, so there needs to be, you know, there's a sensibility overlay to this, and that's emotional intelligence. And that's developed over time, and you know, some people maybe have it more naturally than others and whatnot, but it's absolutely crucial to leadership. And if you subscribe to the theory of leadership being a collective and a team-based approach being better than an individual approach, then EQ is incredibly important, and it's fundamental to running a team. And that plays into those who are more vulnerable, more sensitive, who are more in touch with emotion, who can read a room. That makes really good leaders. So EQ in a team-based approach is hugely important. If it's more individual-based and more kind of, it's my way or nobody else's way, well then it's less important. But I think that way loses every time to the former. So,
any thoughts?
My answer has changed over the years a little bit. I think I'm not as emotionally intelligent as I'd like to be, and actually that's not always been a disadvantage because I think it's encouraged me to ask the question. So I think there is an I'd almost say humility, not believing you have the right answer is maybe as important, if not more important. And so rather than, I don't read the room so well always, I don't know how others are feeling always, I often read it wrong, especially if they're not like me, which is quite a lot of the time. And so just going, what do you mean by that? And how does that really feel? And, you know, asking the question, I found has served me far more as being a leader, being a vulnerable leader, being a successful leader at times.
I would argue that is emotional intelligence.
Okay.
Well, it's
knowing
being,
how little
yeah, but
I have.
It's being aware. It's being aware of the fact that you, like, that to me is emotional intelligence. That's part of it.
Yeah.
But do those questions change if it's a man or woman you're speaking to? So you're asking those same questions to a man versus a woman?
No, actually. I've just been let down by assuming so often. But I think I have really learnt it's better to not assume at all and to ask. I gave the example a couple of years ago that, you know, if somebody was to say, right, I want to understand you, Mitesh, better. So you're of Indian descent, you know, you spent some time in a monastery. Let me go watch the film Gandhi, and I now know, you know, more about you. That would be terrible, right? Or actually, I've got other people. I know some other people have got a name sounding similar to yours. There's a guy called Manish up later. You know, maybe I know him. Maybe I now know you, and I'll use that. It's terrible, terrible. Or I know one woman, therefore I might know another. Just why don't you just ask? How are you feeling? What do you think? What matters to you? What do you value? What are you worried about? What makes it work so much better, in my experience.
Matt, any comments?
Yeah, just a few points I think to build on there. So thinking about this point around emotional intelligence, right? When we think about how that plays out with masculinity, which typically the stereotypes would be, you know, we always know the answer, we're really dominant, you know, we know better, etc. There was a really interesting book that I read recently called "What Got You Here Won't Get You There." I don't know if you've read it.
Great book.
Yeah.
It was like revolutionary to me, and there's basically 21 points in there. It talks about how you take the focus off your own masculinity and get other people feeling more valid, more empowered in what you do, and it was brilliant. And one of the top 21 points was about not always having the right answer, not always being the one to know, but actually helping other people kind of get to it. So I think, you know, how we break down some of these sort of stereotypes around masculinity, I think could be quite interesting. And and how we regulate our emotions as well. And I can certainly talk from my own experience. I am a deeply emotional person. It's, sometimes I go to bed at night and I'm so knackered from the emotional responses in the day. It's like, you've got anxiety, yeah, but I can still sleep because I'm so tired from the emotional response. So I sort of get these like 0 to 100, and then I take myself back down, and I obviously try and objectivise. But that's something I have to constantly work on. And my mentor's really interesting now that he will say to me, if he's in a situation where he knows something will have aggravated me, he'll drop me a note afterwards and tell me that he knows. It's like, okay, how are you going to objectivise that? So it's just really interesting, but that's certainly something I think, we don't often, again, talk about, our emotional responses, but what we tend to see are the behaviours off the back of the emotional responses, maybe where we're overpowering somebody or X, Y, and Z. So I think, getting a really firm grasp of emotional intelligence and how you regulate and become more conscious around your own emotional responses, I think it's a key part of this question around how do we turn negative masculinity into positive masculinity.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm going to ask one last question before I'll turn to the audience, because I think we can do a Slido on questions, and I'll ask a question in a second. But the question I want to ask you, again, it relates to all of this, because clearly all of you have to be authentic. I hope you try to be authentic leaders, but you're also seen as role models, right? Is there challenges with that, being authentic and being a role model?
Sits really awkwardly with me. I tend to kind of run into it and then run away from it in equal measure. I'll tell you why. I think that the term role model, or being considered a role model, risks you caring more about what others think of you than doing the work, the kind of inner work that's needed, that is really hard. And your image and how you're perceived and what others think, I've found certainly has had moments when it's taken up more of my headspace. And that's the opposite of vulnerable, authentic leadership, versus actually going, I don't know, and I don't get it right, and I can't be held up for that. I'm trying to figure it out. But why I do think it's really important, so whether at work and I see the young men or senior men and their struggles in what is a rapidly changing landscape at work, to my friends in their mid-40s, who are parents and young people who are struggling at a rate that I cannot kind of fathom, in being young fathers, parents, husbands, partners, professionals. And I see the power of having those open, vulnerable conversations, being almost not being able to talk about football and not being able to get sloshed, and actually forcing a more deeper conversation. I found so many more buyers for at work and outside of work than I've ever seen in my whole career. And so I think to that extent, I have to push myself to not run away from the term as much, because I think being a role model isn't about getting it right. It's actually where I spend most of my time talking about how I'm struggling and what I'm trying to figure out and where my mistakes are. And the biggest lesson of all was with my son. He's 17 now. And I think we've both been able to help each other so much by me going, I don't know how to do this. When he was struggling with his temper as a young man, to go, I haven't yet figured out how to regulate my temper because I'm losing my shit when you lose yours. But why don't we hug and then figure it out from there? And we did. And then and seeing him learn to communicate how he feels. And he'll say, we had parents' evening a couple of weeks ago, and he goes, Dad, you really embarrassed me at that parents' evening. And I didn't like how you talked about, me. And it made me feel really small. And I was like, I'm so inspired that you're able to tell me that, because I can try and do better. And thank you for so. But there's this real power when we start to talk about these mistakes we make as leaders, as husbands, as workers, as parents, as all of it. And so communication, expression is so critical. And I think that is essential.
Is that essential for your mental health as well, right?
Totally.
To talk it out.
Totally. And where I've struggled the most and when I've been in the darkest places, it's when I haven't. So my own personal thing is kind of expression is the opposite of depression. And so when I'm not in my head, and again, I see my fear, my lightning rod is when I see my dad, as he gets older, get quieter and kind of just in his head. And I can see he's unhappy about things, but he won't talk about them. I can see he's failed at things or struggled with things, and he won't share it. Always reminds me to go further, but it is, expression is the opposite, and it's what I have to keep reminding myself, because it isn't easy and it doesn't come naturally.
Any thoughts?
Just to pick on that last point, I think it's much less likely, I think, as a man, certainly from my background anyway, that you don't talk about the things that are in your head, and you spend more time in your head.
Yeah.
I was thinking now, through my childhood years, there's never been, I can't actually think of one time where I've actually sat down with my dad and talked about feelings. Like, I think the world of him, he's a great dad, but we've never actually, how are you feeling about that? Like, never gone there. So whether it's being a northern thing, you don't talk about you just go out and do a good day's work and all of that.
Just a man thing.
Exactly, just get on with it, Man up was something I used to hear a lot of, when I was pushing my friend's pram down the road. So it was really difficult, because you never had that space to, to really talk about how you felt. And actually, the more that you don't talk about it, to your point, the more it goes into your mind and it becomes this, thing that gets out of control. And that's, of course, is then when you start leading to things like, depression and feeling down and etc. And I've got a lot of friends now who, have got, young children who are men, and they're also really struggling. And we've not even talked about what social media is doing to exacerbate this whole issue of painting these pictures of perfection, everywhere you look. And I think that also adds that pressure on that, ideal sort of perfectionism of being a strong, successful man with a six-pack, which is ultimately what you see on Instagram all the time. So, I think it's really important now more than ever that we talk about, these issues as pressures increase from, everywhere we look. And I think as a leader now in organisations, I don't think it's possible to be a really successful leader and bring people on that journey with you, particularly the younger folks, if you're not talking about well-being or mental health, or certainly, you've got to be conscious of having those conversations. I think about my own team as well. Like, I've got folks that are older, but the folks that I'd say are below 28, they're talking about mental health every day. It's like, wow, this is, and it's just such a different world from what I came from. But yeah, going back to your point about role modelling, I think being a role model, part of that is about role modelling, not doing something very well, etc. Anyway, I'll hand the baton back over because I know we're running out of time.
Anything?
No,
Regards to the question?
They've summed it up brilliantly.
Okay. So audience, I think we're going to do a Slido question, And basically the question is, how comfortable do you feel being uncomfortable out of a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most comfortable? Does that come up? Hopefully it's come up. If it hasn't, I can't see it. Sorry? I'll do hands, okay. Sorry, let's do hands very quickly. How comfortable do you feel being uncomfortable in your workplaces? So in other words, having these uncomfortable conversations, being a male and being vulnerable, 5 being the most comfortable. Show of hands for, I can't show hands 1 to 5, can I?
There you go.
Who feels uncomfortable?
People are
Yeah. Is that meaning you're feeling uncomfortable?
3.
3. Okay. It's really interesting because I think, being a leader nowadays, you have to be uncomfortable all the time. I think it's so hard not to be uncomfortable when talking to your staff. I think you have to know your staff. I think in the old factory, traditional industrial age where everyone did the same thing, left at 5, the times have changed. As you talked about social media, it's kind of changing people and changing expectations in the workplace. So I always say it's really important to know your people before you really need to know them. So for example, compliance, I always use the example, you don't talk to compliance for the first time when there's a problem. You need to talk to them way before. You need to already build that relationship. So as leaders, you need to build relationships with your colleagues and staff. Last thing, has anyone got any questions for the panel? Has anyone got any questions at all? Okay, one question just in the middle. Do you want to go for it?
I don't know if there's a microphone. Out of curiosity,
I'm happy to give it a go.
Yeah.
I think the question was, we all seem to be talking about a similar approach, and is there almost, can the market be saturated with that approach? I think we're nowhere near saturation. I don't see, broadly speaking, and I think Aviva are quite good, and it's probably our work here. I think we attract a kind of certain type of people, and I think we're better than some places. But I think broadly speaking, I don't think people use team-based, vulnerable, collaborative approaches effectively. They talk about it, and everybody says we should do this. It makes sense. But when you look at how they operate, they don't invest time in how that works, because it's not easy to have a team that's actually collaborative. It takes time. And it's not easy to be a leader that's vulnerable for all the reasons we just talked about. So that's actually unique. So I don't think we're anywhere near the point of saturation. I think, in fact, I think it's unique to have a proper team-based collaborative approach.
Okay, I have to end because I'm getting in trouble. So the last thing I'll say is I loved what you said, Mitesh. Expression is the opposite of depression. So if we can take that as a call to action, do express yourselves, do think about your mental health in your workplaces, don't suffer in silence as well. So that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Panelists. I need to